The morning fog clung to the valley, thick and still, as Claire stepped onto the porch with 2 steaming cups of coffee. A German Shepherd mix, large and lean, stood at the edge of the tree line, its amber eyes locked with Claire's as she wrapped her robe tightly around her shoulders and stared out into the woods. There was something knowing in the dog's gaze, something almost human, but it wasn't the dog itself that made her breath catch. It was what it held in its mouth, a blue Gore-Tex jacket, Michael's jacket, the jacket he'd been wearing the day he disappeared. Claire's coffee slipped from her hands, the ceramic mug shattering on the wooden planks of the porch, but she barely noticed. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the early morning silence. The dog took a cautious step closer, then another, until she could see the mud on its fur, the prickles tangled in its fur. It had come from deep in the wilderness. It had come to find her. Her hands shook as she reached for her coat. And then something fluttered from one of the pockets. A small, crumpled piece of paper. Michael's handwriting. "If you're reading this, I'm still alive." Claire's fingers shook as she snatched the note from the air, her pulse hammering so loudly she could barely hear the world around her. The paper was damp, smudged with dirt and time, but the words were unmistakable. Michael's. She traced the faded ink, her breath catching on the first line. "If you're reading this, I'm still alive." Her knees nearly buckled. It was impossible. Michael had been gone for 6 years. The search teams had scoured every inch of the wilderness, combing through ravines, caves, and riverbanks. They had found nothing, no clues, no trail. Just his abandoned car near the old logging road, as if he had simply walked into the forest and vanished. And yet, here was his jacket, intact. And here in her shaking hands was his message, his plea for help. The German Shepherd sat patiently before her, watching her reaction as if he understood the weight of what he had brought. His ears flicked at the sound of Claire's ragged breathing, but he didn't move, didn't waver. He had come here for a reason. Claire forced herself to focus, her eyes darting across the note. "Followed the wrong trail. Underground tunnels. Entrance collapsed. Running out of time." The rest was too faded to read, but the final line was crystal clear. "I love you. Always." Tears burned in her eyes. 6 years. 6 years of grieving, of accepting the impossible, of trying to let go. And now, this? She turned to the dog, heart pounding. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. The shepherd stood, took a step toward the trees, then looked back at her expectantly. Claire swallowed hard. He wanted her to follow. Claire's breath hitched as the dog took another step toward the trees. His amber eyes locked onto hers with an urgency she couldn't ignore. The wind stirred the morning fog, sending a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Every rational part of her screamed that this was impossible. Michael was gone. He had been gone for 6 years, but the jacket was real. The note was real, and the dog knew something. Heart pounding, she turned back toward the house, her mind racing. She needed her boots, a flashlight, her phone. But what if she lost the trail? What if the dog disappeared before she was ready? She couldn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat from the porch railing and stepped off the wooden planks, crunching into the damp grass below. "All right," she whispered, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "Show me." The dog gave a small woof, then turned, trotting toward the forest with purpose. Claire followed, barely aware of the branches snapping beneath her feet, of the cold seeping into her fingers. She kept her eyes on the dog's moving form, his dark coat blending into the shifting mist. The farther they went, the deeper the silence became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of her own ragged breathing and the soft padding of paws ahead. Then, without warning, the dog stopped. His ears pricked forward, his tail stiff. Claire followed his gaze and her stomach lurched. A trail, faint but visible, wound between the trees, leading towards something she had never noticed before. A break in the earth, a narrow, jagged opening, like the mouth of something waiting. A cave. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the dark opening in the earth. The jagged maw of the cave seemed to swallow the morning light, a gaping void carved into the mountain. She had lived in this valley for years, had walked these woods countless times, and yet she had never seen this place before. How had Michael found it? And more importantly, was he still inside? The German shepherd stood at the entrance, his body tense, ears pricked forward. He didn't bark or growl, but there was something in the way he stood, waiting, watching, that sent a shiver down Claire's spine. He wasn't just leading her here, he was guarding something. She took a slow, measured step forward, her breath clouding in the chilly air. "Michael?" she called, her voice cracking in the silence. Nothing. Just the distant drip of water echoing from within, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the cavernous dark. Claire fumbled for her phone, flicking on the flashlight. The beam cut into the blackness, revealing slick rock walls and the faint remnants of old footprints in the dirt. Her stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Hard hammering, she reached for the radio clipped to her belt. "Peter," she said, pressing the call button. "I found something." Static. She swallowed hard. No signal. The shepherd let out a low whine and stepped inside, disappearing into the shadows. Claire hesitated for only a second before following, gripping her flashlight like a lifeline. As she crossed the threshold, the weight of the mountain seemed to press in around her, the air thick and damp. Somewhere deep inside, a sound echoed, faint, rhythmic, like a voice trying to reach her. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped deeper into the cave, her flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. The damp scent of earth and stone filled her lungs, mingling with something else. Something metallic, like rusted iron. Water dripped from the ceiling, the droplets echoing in the cavern's depths. But beneath that, there was another sound, faint, uneven, a voice. Her heart clenched. "Michael?" The German shepherd, no, her dog now, she realized, paused ahead of her, his ears twitching, his body taut with anticipation. Then he moved forward, his paws silent on the stone. Claire followed, her pulse thrumming with a mixture of hope and fear. How was this possible? How had Michael survived 6 years in this place? The tunnel twisted, narrowing until she had to duck under a low-hanging rock formation. Her flashlight flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through her. What if the batteries died? What if she got stuck? What if... A groan, low, weak. Claire froze. Then she ran. She nearly slipped on the damp stone, but she didn't stop, didn't hesitate. The shepherd was already ahead of her, tail high, leading her toward a shallow alcove, illuminated by the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern. And there, a figure, thin, gaunt, leaning against the cavern wall, his wrists bound with fraying rope. His hair was longer, streaked with gray, and his beard was thick, unkempt. His clothes were torn, hanging loose on a frame that had once been strong. But the moment his head lifted, the moment their eyes met, Claire choked on a sob. "Michael!" His breath hitched, his lips parted. "Claire?" His voice was hoarse, raw from disuse. He blinked as if not trusting what he was seeing. "You found me!" Tears blurred her vision as she stumbled forward, dropping to her knees beside him. She touched his face, tracing the sharp angles, the sunken cheeks. "I thought you were dead." His fingers trembled as they brushed against hers. "I thought..." "I'd never see you again." The dog pressed close, whining softly, his warm body grounding them both. Claire turned, her heart hardening with determination. "Who did this to you?" Michael swallowed, his gaze flickering toward the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. "They're still here." The story is far from over. What would you do if someone you loved had been missing for years, only to find out they were alive, but not alone? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see how this mystery unfolds, make sure to follow the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Your support helps us create more stories like this. Stories about love, loyalty, and the power of never giving up. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.